Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome. I'm Tom Ankner, the director of the library's Charles F. Cummings, New Jersey Information Center. Tonight, we are pleased to host this presentation of the Newark History Society, Discovering Newark History in Washington, D.C., an update on the Newark Archives project, allows us all to hear about Newark-related goodies found by archivist Gail Malmgreen in Washington, D.C. After Gail's talk, she will answer questions from the audience. Please type any comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. Gail will field as many as possible after her talk. Now, to introduce Gail and her presentation, here is Timothy J. Crist, president and co-founder of the Newark History Society. Tim?
Well, thanks, Tom, and let me add my welcome on behalf of the Newark History Society. It's good to see that so many have joined this program right at the beginning. And we're really pleased tonight to have Gail Malmgreen report on her work in Washington, D.C., identifying Newark resources for history. Gail is both a historian and an archivist, a graduate of Waquake High School, holds a PhD in history. She worked as an editor on the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony papers. She was the associate head of archives at NYU's Tenement Library, where the Robert Wagner labor archives are. So she has really been the perfect person to lead our Newark Archives project that the Newark History Society co-sponsors with Rutgers University. And she's led the project since the beginning over the last decade or so. And she has brought a full measure of knowledge and experience, dedication to be sure, but also an abundance of curiosity to the task. And she keeps finding really interesting items to describe and to let folks know about through our Newark Archives project. So we're delighted that she's agreed tonight to talk about the Newark Archives project and discuss the extraordinary resources for Newark history that she's identified in Washington, D.C. collections. So hand it over to you now, Gail, and at the end we'll have questions and learn even more about the work you've been doing with the Newark Archives project. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom and Tim, and to the library for hosting this. And thanks to everybody who's joined in. I hope I can live up to Tim's predictions, shall we say. As he's told you, I've been working for most of the last 10 years or so, part-time, but very devotedly, to hunt up and describe archival material about Newark history, all topics, all periods, wherever it can be found. This means manuscript collections, photograph and film collections, oral histories, maps, posters, and even some rare printed items. The result is the ever-expanding Newark Archives Project website, where you can now search and read detailed descriptions of Newark materials from more than 4,000 collections held by more than 200 archives and libraries. You can also search the site by archive, by the way. For example, if you want to see what kind of Newark material we found at the Baseball Hall of Fame, or the archives of the Metropolitan Museum, Howard University Library, or the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library in Texas, you can easily find out on the website. Now, we do get it that traveling to archives is an expensive proposition. So we also give you the contact information for any archive we mention. And in many cases, you can order scans or photocopies depending on how much you want. Try to order a box, but the chances are you could get an item or a folder. Lately, we've been finding more and more material that has been digitized by archivists who can afford it. And we do provide links to this material as well. But tonight is all about Washington. After years spent surveying dozens of archives in New Jersey and New York, I headed to DC, a mecca for any researcher, whatever your topic. And as expected, it proved to be a gold mine of Newark-related historical material. From 2017 to 2019, I spent many weeks there. And what follows are just a very few, I hope, tantalizing examples of what I found. First, however, a mini apology. There was a bit of false advertising in our flyer for today. It mentions the National Archives, the most massive and difficult of all Washington repositories. I must confess I barely scratched the surface of it so far. I was all ready to tackle it seriously last winter, and then the pandemic struck and the archives closed. So the National Archives, number one on my agenda, is a mountain still to be climbed. If only I could fit in all of Washington in tonight's talk, but no, I won't be talking about, for example, Newark-related papers of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and other historical celebrities. I can't resist, however, noting that Benjamin Franklin visited Newark in 1757, and he really, really liked it. He said it was a most beautiful place and noted that it was a pleasant change from New York. I also won't have time for the records of Newark inventors and artists at the Smithsonian, or for the Civil Rights Oral History Project, the Veterans Oral History Project, or the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Oral History Collection. All of them include Newark archives. Check them out on our website. I'm sorry, Newark interviews, I should have said. Check them out on our website. I've tried to pick examples that could spark some new ideas about Newark and Newarkers, new angles for approaching our history, and we hope some topics for future research projects. Just keep one phrase in mind as I talk. Tip of the iceberg. I'll start out on a light note. My brief encounter with the Daughters of the American Revolution, whose very grand headquarters is on 17th Street, a stone's throw from the White House. I confess I approached it somewhat nervously, knowing the DAR to be an organization with a problematic history of elitist values and racist policies. Maybe non-members weren't welcome. Not at all. As I stepped in the front door, I was warmly greeted by two volunteers, middle-aged ladies with Southern accents. They were most eager to tell me that the DAR has loosened up its requirements for membership and is clearly looking for new recruits. No longer have to be descended from a revolutionary officer, they explained. In fact, if your ancestor did anything at all to help the patriot cause, perhaps offering food or water to the passing troops, or even hay for the horses, you could qualify. Would I be interested in joining? They looked hopeful, but alas, I had to admit that no ancestor of mine set foot on this continent before the 1890s. We missed the revolution by a century or so. I was then free to wander through the building on my own, great fun, and found hanging in one of the hallways a framed portrait of Marian Anderson, famously forbidden to sing in the DAR auditorium in this very building in 1939. I later discovered that the DAR website has a whole page devoted to Anderson. It doesn't quite explain why she was turned away, but the DAR apparently admires her very much nowadays. And Anderson did sing in the DAR auditorium on several occasions, the first time in 1942. I hadn't known that. I then arrived at the library. This picture doesn't begin to do it justice. It's a stunningly beautiful room. And sometimes when you first see it, it makes you want to sit down at a desk immediately, work there for hours. It holds an impressive genealogical collection and a computer database of the very elaborate application materials past members submitted to prove that they were genuine descendants. Newark had a very large chapter many years, and I found that New Jersey women were among the first members to agitate for integrating the DAR itself. And breaking news, the DAR library is now in the process of reimagining itself. It recently announced a substantial new acquisition plan that will make it a center for research on, wait for it, Native Americans, presumably emphasizing the complex history of Native Americans during the Revolution, a worthy topic and relevant to New Jersey too. Their next exhibit, when the building reopens, will be on that theme. Small institutions like these are very well worth a visit, and there are loads of them in Washington. Admission is free, and if you go on a weekday, as I did, you will probably have the great luxury of exploring them as a solitary visitor. And so on to the Library of Congress, my favorite of all archives outside of New Jersey. This is the old building, the palatial Jefferson building. Everyone should visit it, whether you're doing library research or not. It's worth it just to see the building. It's located, as I said, just behind the Capitol, very easy to find. And you find in it books, periodicals, grand exhibits, and the all-important gift shop. The National Archives is the government's archive. The Library of Congress, so easy to visit, so easy to use, is truly the people's library. Long may it avoid budget cuts. To find manuscripts and other archival collections, you cross the street to the Madison Building, opened in 1980, not so beautiful, and this picture not flattering, but well suited to its purpose and very user-friendly. As you see, much of what you want is right there on the ground floor. You come in the main entrance, you leave your luggage and coats in the check room, you get a reader's card, you walk around to the manuscript department, you find plentiful bathrooms, plentiful elevators, 2 cafeterias in the building, very inexpensive, and you only have to go upstairs to the photo division. You could live there, and sometimes I felt as if I did, but it's truly a wonderful place to work. Here's the entrance to the manuscript room. You get a locker, you sign in with the staff, and you find that they are the best, absolutely supremely helpful. In fact, they're the only archivist I've met outside Newark itself who really got interested in what I was doing and what I was finding. They even gave me tips about collections I might look at, and they would ask me every day, what did you find about Newark today? They're so kind of user-friendly that you get the impression that they truly enjoy showing hordes of researchers, nouveau researchers, how to use the scanners and the microfilm readers and so on. This is not a common experience in archives, I've found. The manuscript room has its own small reference library, all in the same room. You see the old card file catalog on the right, they have book stacks, and an entire wall of cabinets that are filled with nothing but guides to microfilm collections. Many of them are to microfilmed collections owned by the Library of Congress, but many more are to collections on libraries all over the country. And as I carefully combed these drawers and used a lot of this microfilm, as you'll see later, I realized that just having this resource there can save you literally thousands of dollars and many months of travel. It's a tremendously rich resource, and I have yet to plumb all of it. Returning to the bookshelves, what you find there are loads of editions, published editions of archival materials, which can be, again, a tremendous boon to researchers like me. In these volumes, you can quickly find your Newark references because they're indexed. You can borrow them by interlibrary loan from your local library if necessary, which you can't do with manuscript boxes. And looking, for example, at the Booker T. Washington papers on the right, all 14 volumes of them. The originals are held by the Library of Congress, but the collection is so vast and the finding aid to it is so sketchy that it wouldn't really have been possible physically to go through all these hundreds of boxes. I used the published edition and I found it to be a really, really helpful resource. Booker T. Washington traveled constantly, touring, speaking, raising money. We know he spoke at North Bethany Baptist Church on at least one occasion. And when he told audiences about his Tuskegee Institute, he was necessarily upbeat, emphasizing its successes and aspirations as a kind of miraculous oasis in Jim Crow, Alabama. But for a frank, unvarnished view of life at the school, look at the letters and monthly reports of Dr. John Kenney, who spent more than 20 years at Tuskegee as Washington's personal physician and the Institute's medical director, before moving to Newark in 1924 to found the city's first hospital to serve the Black community. Each one of those volumes I showed you includes dozens of Kenney's reports, and there are many hundreds more in the full manuscript collection. Kenney pulls no punches. He writes about financial problems, poor sanitation, rickety buildings, students who arrive from places like Haiti, suffering from tropical diseases, students from the South with severe medical problems, untreated for years because they had never seen a doctor. Inevitably, Kenney's hospital and clinic were very soon flooded with patients from the surrounding towns and counties. He couldn't find competent nurses because there was no nursing school for them. When he trained his own staff, they often left for better jobs in city hospitals. All this tells us a lot about what Dr. Kenney endured, what shaped his thinking, what made him leave Alabama to come to Newark, and what he hoped to do there. A group in Newark now is planning to make a museum from his old hospital building, and I do hope they'll find space to tell the story of his long journey to Newark. The Booker T. Washington papers are voluminous, but the Marcus Garvey papers on the left in red here are a very different story. During his brief tumultuous US crusade for Black self-sufficiency and self-government, he faced constant harassment by the authorities and eventual imprisonment and deportation. As a result, not much has survived from his personal papers or records of his organization. But these few volumes represent an absolutely brilliant feat of documentary editing. Garvey's history is painstakingly pieced together from reports of police spies, from newspaper accounts and other print sources, all supported and sometimes challenged by extensive footnotes. Let us just say that the police spies were not always 100% reliable. What we learn here, in a nutshell, is that Garvey had a considerable body of supporters in Newark, and they remained loyal to his movement for quite a few years after Garvey himself disappeared from the scene. When the definitive history of Black nationalism in Newark is written, that story will certainly begin many decades before the 1960s. Now to the manuscript collections of the Library of Congress itself. This story begins in 1912 when Mercer Green Jackson, an attractive and eager young man, arrived to take up the post of rector of Trinity Church, Trinity Episcopal Church, one of Newark's oldest and wealthiest congregations. He was recently married and had a few years' experience at other churches, mostly in positions arranged for him by his father, a liberal Episcopal bishop in Texas. Fortunately for us, every detail of Johnston's brief stay in Newark is meticulously recorded in the long emotional letters he wrote to his father, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Johnston could have guessed that the road ahead in Newark would be bumpy when he arrived for a job interview and stayed at the home of Cortland Parker Jr., the most influential member of Trinity Church's vestry. Parker, a lifelong bachelor and corporate lawyer, belonged to one of Newark's oldest families and was extremely proud of his pedigree. Johnston took an instant dislike to him. He disliked Parker's grand home, his formal manners, his conservative politics, and his snobbishness. Not a promising start, right? But Johnston was young, idealistic, and brimming with self-confidence, a keen advocate of the social gospel. He was out to change the world, beginning with Trinity Church, Newark. It would be his experiment in social reform. I wish I had a younger picture of him. I apologize. This was the only one I could find. He began by flinging open the church doors, welcoming immigrants, Blacks, the poor, all who wished to enter. In a whirlwind of innovation, he started clubs for children and teenagers, free lunches, special programs for the deaf and blind, outreach to the unemployed, concerts, you name it. When a strike of 4,000 Newark garment workers broke out in 1912, Johnston marched with the strikers and wrote strong articles for the Union Press. To top that, he declared himself a socialist and campaigned for local socialist candidates. His entertaining sermons sometimes blasted wealthy members of Trinity as drunkards and adulterers who thought of nothing but money. All this gained him quite a few friends in Newark, including prominent liberals like John Cobb Dana and Beatrice Windsor of the Newark Public Library. But the vestrymen of Trinity Church, to put it mildly, were not happy. The final crunch came when war broke out in Europe, and Johnston became a passionate advocate of U.S. intervention. He denounced Woodrow Wilson as a coward and said in one sermon, "To me, the crucifixion of Belgium upon the Iron Cross and the massacre of the innocents on the Lusitania as awful as and as real as the crucifixion of Jesus." His preaching became more and more hysterically anti-German. Predictably, this brought a chorus of complaints from prominent German-American Newarkers. The situation came to a head one fateful day in 1916, described in a furious 22-page letter to his father, when Johnston got a visit from his old enemy, Cortlandt Parker Jr. After a few pleasantries, as Mercer put it, I began to smell a rat. Mr. Parker's message was blunt. The vestry felt that Johnston should take a leave of absence, or they would pay handsomely if he decided to leave. He chose to leave, thus becoming the first Trinity pastor to be pushed out of his job since a loyalist rector fled back to England during the Revolution. The end played out like a Victorian melodrama. Mercer describes how his devoted Irish maid, Maggie, although a Catholic, wept as he and his wife packed their bags. The vestry had hoped he'd leave quietly. Not a chance. He allowed his supporters to carry him on their shoulders in a huge parade down Broad Street, right past Trinity Church. And he preached one last fiery sermon denouncing the elders of Trinity and had it published and widely distributed. Like many melodramas, this one had quite a happy ending. When the U.S. entered the war, Johnston volunteered, served with great courage in the front lines, and was wounded. He returned to begin a new career in social work and ended up serving with distinction in several New Deal agencies as a specialist in housing and labor issues. 1916, the year that Johnston left, was something of a golden year in Newark. There were new buildings, better schools, cultural achievements, a general air of civic pride and prosperity, epitomized by the lavish celebrations for the city's 250th anniversary. But there were darker sides to life in Newark. The world knows Lewis Hine's memorable photos of children working in the mines and cotton mills, but I hadn't realized that Hine also worked in Newark. He visited the city several times, accompanied by the committee's investigators. You can read their careful, sometimes heartbreaking reports in the manuscripts room, and then go to the photo collection and match the reports to Heinz photos. If you arrived at Newark's Penn Station at 10 or 11 o'clock at night in the early 1800s, you might be sold a newspaper by a boy of 7 or 8 years old. Here, the older boy, Max, is 8. The brothers said they worked until 10 p.m. On the streets of downtown, boys and girls sold papers, candy, and pretzels, sang and played instruments, shined shoes, and ran errands for customers of saloons. Children worked because they had to, often because a father had died or was too sick to work. But poverty was widespread, and some of the newsboys actually had a bit of an edge. One teacher spoke movingly of how a child in her class had died during the Spanish flu epidemic, and she thought it would be fitting for the class to send a bunch of flowers to the funeral. But the children had nothing to give until a couple of newsboys put their hands in their pockets and pulled out enough to cover the cost. Teachers sometimes weren't sure whether these newsboys were their brightest students who were sort of budding future entrepreneurs, or were just useless delinquents who were truants and probably headed for a bad end. It was tougher for Black delivery boys like these two. In Black neighborhoods, routes were longer and customers fewer, and the need was greater. The committee's investigators visited 4- and 5-story tenements with dark hallways, coal stoves, no water except for a pump in the yard, and one toilet per floor, often broken. Apartments are usually described in just one word: filthy. They were told of truancy, gang fights, children who fell asleep in school or were sent home because they were too sick or dirty or infested with vermin. The streets of Newark could be hazardous, and not only for children. A young social worker reported in 1919 that men in cars solicited her as she walked on Broad Street in the evening. She said she was approached by men every time she walked on the streets, day or night, in the 2 weeks she had been in Newark. Another social worker said she would not want her daughter, if she had one, to room in Newark, as it is a wide open town in every sense of the word. Things hadn't changed much for poor children by the 1920s. Some, as we see, worked at home. The caption for this photo reads, "I found a girl of 13 working at embroidery in a far corner of a dimly lit room. For this dress, elaborately embroidered, she received 90 cents. She could finish one dress in 3 or 4 days. She worked from 4 p.m. to 10:30. Remember this picture next time you watch Downton Abbey. Something I learned from these reports and from other collections I've seen is that most of this homework was not done for Newark employers. The slums of Newark in these years were functioning as a kind of giant sweatshop for the New York market. And this suggests a big book, more likely several books, crying out to be written. The topic is Newark's relationship to New York. Can you think of any aspect of Newark's history in which the role of New York, for better and often for worse, has not been a factor? In this case, the hard part was actually finding the archive. It started when my friend Professor Ann Gordon at Rutgers, New Brunswick, told me of a grad student she had who said she had seen some Newark archival material at the Bethune House. I knew that Bethune, great educator and founder of the National Council of Negro Women, had spoken in Newark several times, but I had no idea what would be stored at her house. On its website, I learned that the house would be closed for renovations for at least 2 years. That set me back. But in the small print, there was a message that said, "Call the Frederick Douglass House for further information." So I called the Douglass House, and the person who answered the phone sounded like a very young student intern. He turned out to be my savior. He said, Oh, if you're interested in those collections, you will find them here. Whoops. Okay. The National Archives for Black Women's History were created by a group that grew out of the National Council of Negro Women and used Bethune House as a base. Their collection efforts were spectacularly successful, but eventually the group faded away. Meanwhile, their archive had grown far too big to be stored at Bethune House, so it became the responsibility of the Parks Commission, the Park Service, which administers the house as a National Historic Site, and the archive was moved. To get to the place requires 45 minutes on the metro, followed by a local bus ride. You then find yourself staring at a nondescript building surrounded by strip malls and warehouses. But it is so well worth the trek. The place has a kind of park ranger vibe. Everyone is very glad to see you. There are guards at the door. You're welcome to bring your lunch and share the staff lunchroom, which is quite nice. And there are 2 professional archivists. One reason the place remains a well-kept secret is that as yet they don't have a collection list or any finding aids on their website. But they reply promptly to emails, and they will send you scans of some of the paper lists and inventories that they've pulled together. The archive holds more than 100 collections, including 1,500 feet of the records of the National Council of Negro Women. And here are just a few of the others, just a few. They have 66 collections apart from 40 sections of the National Council papers. It gives you some kind of an idea of the sorts of things that you find here. And you, generally speaking, won't find them anyplace else. Here's just one collection. And I've selected these items to make the point. Well, first of all, the collection as a whole sheds light on what has been a crucially important area of work for Black women: designing, dressmaking, millinery, fashion shows, charm schools, and so on. Newark had plenty of these businesses and events, and a very active Naacp chapter, which eventually helped its members to break into the big-time fashion scene in New York. As you can see from these few items from the collection, fashion connects to church history, to civil rights. It links generations. They had junior clubs connected with these organizations. And it was a significant link between gay and straight Newark. Someone, please research this history. It is so worth it. George Washington University Library, very attractive, is home to the huge archive of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, among other collections. The Teamsters were exceptionally generous. When they donated their records, they also paid for refurbishing the archive's reading room, funding a full-time archivist for their collection, and most important, they bought state-of-the-art equipment so the whole collection could be digitized. I believe they're up to somewhere in the 1960s now, from the late 19th century. Newark, as a factory town, had lots of warehouses, and they in turn required lots of trucks. So the Teamsters always had plenty of clout, both in local labor and in city politics. We know of their sorry history of gangsterism at many levels. But what's less well known is that there were also liberal traditions in the Union. Few may remember today that Newark's reforming mayor of the 1950s, Leo Carlin, had been a president of a Teamsters local. There's one Newark letter that caught my eye in the digitized records. In 1944, Mr. Hugh O'Toole of 18 James Street wrote to longtime Teamster president Dan Tobin, "The men in my warehouse do not want to be in a union with black men. You would get hundreds more members if you started a new all-white local." Not exactly a patriotic attitude in the face of wartime labor shortages when everyone was supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder and so on. Someone in the national office wrote on this letter, "This guy is a crank." And it was made very clear in subsequent correspondence that the union would not be following O'Toole's advice. Of course, it would be of interest to know what happened to these jobs of Black warehouse workers once the war was over. Back to the Library of Congress and more of Black women's history. Nanny Burroughs of Washington, D.C., educator, orator, militant civil rights activist, suffragist, and an outstanding leader of women's activity in the Black Baptist Church, is finally getting the recognition she deserves. She got a respectful mention in Henry Louis Gates' recent PBS program on the Black Church. And just a few weeks ago, a page in the Star Ledger. She was a tremendously popular speaker and appeared in Newark on a number of times. Burroughs School for Young Women in Washington was up against many of the same problems that challenged Tuskegee. Finances were precarious. To keep the school afloat, Burroughs developed a flourishing mail-order publishing business, writing much of the material herself. Here's one of her order forms sent in by a customer in Newark. As you see, she had a lot to offer: sermons, reports, poems, plays, children's books, manuals, office supplies, and her popular quarterly magazine, The Worker, which cost only $1 a year. Dozens of Newark church women and clergy wrote to her regularly. You can read about them on our website. It's in collections like this that we find our local church history. The collection had one big surprise in store for us: Burroughs' secret weapon, a trusted right-hand woman who tirelessly traveled the country from coast to coast for more than 30 years, speaking to women's church groups, selling literature and subscriptions, and recruiting students for the school. Who was Ella Whitfield? The collection has hundreds of letters from her reporting on her travels and her work, but saying almost nothing about herself. Where did she come from? Was she a Newarker originally? Her family, her education? You know, nothing. Her home base was always Newark, at least as we can see in the collection. She had a practical living arrangement there, renting a room, a single room, in the house of a family she liked, and she paid $2 a week for it. Clearly, local Baptist women loved her, but she sometimes ran into opposition from male pastors who didn't welcome competition for the few dollars their congregations could contribute, especially during the Depression years. And of course, some of them just didn't care for a feisty female speaker invading their churches. She shows up everywhere: Texas, California, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, all up and down the East Coast. More than anything, the ceaseless, stressful traveling of Ella Whitfield reminded me of the punishing tours by Susan B. Anthony 70 or 80 years before in the cause of women's suffrage. So come on, researchers, find out who Ella was. I know you're out there and I know you can do it. Organizational records took up most of my time at the library. Here are just some of the political ones I looked at. These national collections almost always have a series devoted to local branches, arranged by state and city. And in the New Jersey sections, Newark looms large. Of course, you find local membership lists, financial and activity reports, and so on. But most entertaining are the times when disputes break out in a local chapter, and both sides have to tell the national office all about it. Sometimes the national office even has to send a staffer out to check on what's going on. This happened in Newark quite often. It's not news to find that the Communist Party was expelling people. but you'd be surprised at how hot things could get in the League of Women Voters. Americans for Democratic Action even had trials to expel dissident members. For a glimpse, or a different glimpse, of the a different glimpse of the German community of Newark, take a look at the Socialist Labor Party papers. Most of them are in German. And if you have a vision of the German community as being made up mostly of wealthy brewers and jewelers, you find here a whole subculture of radical Germans, some of them refugees from the 1848 revolutions. The papers are spectacularly difficult to read and sort of fading letter books, but for anyone who can read German, they're a really rich source. In the field of civil rights, we find the following. Imagine being able to look at all these collections in one room. The Naacp Collection, more than 4,000 boxes, is one of the library's most heavily used. It has loads of material on the Newark branch. You trace the history year by year, from a list of the founding members in 1914 through anti-lynching and police brutality campaigns, contested branch elections, and much, much more. Here you can learn what the various organizations thought about each other and how they negotiated over turf. Really good stuff. And as a footnote, I must mention Lester Granger, someone who is arguably the most important national civil rights leader to come out of Newark. Of all the little known Newarkers I've come across, I think he is the one most worthy of a full-scale biography. Someone please write it. You will find his professional papers here in the Urban League records, and his riveting personal papers are at Yale. His family story is incredible. His father, like Alexander Hamilton, came from the Caribbean islands as a boy in about 1880, with no money at all, managed to get through college, had medical training, became a respected doctor in Newark, had 6 sons, all graduates of Barringer, outstanding in academics and in sports, all graduates of Ivy League colleges, and all except for Lester became lawyers or doctors. I won't tell you more, but the whole story is just extraordinary. And it's a fascinating picture of a family, a Black family in early 20th century. By all means, use these major civil rights collections. But for a different take on civil rights history in Newark, try this one. The 500 boxes are stored off-site, and judging from the dust on them, they're not much used. Clark, a New Yorker, was nationally renowned sociologist. He taught at a number of universities and served on many prestigious commissions. His research was used in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Eventually, he headed up the Metropolitan Applied Research Center in New York, a combination think tank and granting agency for urban projects. Over the years, Clark often focused his research and writing on Newark, and he developed a somewhat agonized relationship to the city. The collection is packed with revealing interviews, memos, off-the-cuff remarks, confidential correspondence, so much that is new and different. Clark knew Amiri Baraka quite well and helped to fund what may have been Baraka's most important and successful political campaign, the 1970-71 effort to block a crude attempt to gerrymander New Jersey's 10th congressional district with the purpose of preventing the election of a Black representative. The district, redrawn by Baraka's group to take in Newark and East Orange, went on to deliver Donald Payne's 11 terms in Congress. In 1971, Baraka submitted a letter of recommendation with his grant request. It reads in part, "I am delighted to recommend Mr. Baraka. He is a very creative and sincere man. He is not merely inventive and genius, but he has a very practical sense of organization and administration." It was signed, Rabbi Joachim Prince, Temple B'nai Abraham, Newark. Prince already knew Kenneth Clark, who had spoken at B'nai Abraham. Sorry. Anyway. And this very moment, the rabbi was working closely with Baraka. B'nai Abraham was relocating to the suburbs and wanted to sell its imposing building on Clinton Avenue. Baraka developed a plan to buy the synagogue and convert it into a cultural center and facility to train young people for careers in the media. The plan was quite well advanced, and you can read about it in records at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, but it fell through for lack of money. An editorial note: "I think it would be entirely fitting if Mayor Ras Baraka were to restore this iconic building and make his father's dream, or some version of it, a reality." The tale of Kenneth Clark's relationship to Newark is a long and tangled one. He crossed swords ineffectively with Mayor Hugh Adonisio, walked streets in dismay days after the violence of July 1967, went on to become an informal advisor to Mayor Ken Gibson. Toward the end of his life, he was asked in an oral history interview to sum up what he thought of Newark. He said, "It's a fantastic jungle." So researchers, which of you is going to write the big book on the history of 20th century civil rights activity in Newark? It must be done. I conclude with two Newarkers who have already secured their place in history, garlanded with honors and with biographies already on the shelves. Newark's William Brennan is widely considered to be the most influential Supreme Court justice of the 20th century and one of the most progressive. I would have guessed that he was named to the court by John F. Kennedy, but no. Brennan was appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower shortly before the 1956 presidential election. Eisenhower's advisors thought the appointment of a Roman Catholic Democrat from the Northeast would give him a boost in the re-election campaign. These were truly bipartisan times. The choice of Brennan, as his papers reveal, owed much to three Newarkers who should be better known than they are, all liberal Republicans. Bernard M. Shanley III was a member of a prominent Newark Catholic family, a graduate of St. Benedict's Prep and roommate of the immortal Lou Gehrig at Columbia University. How many of you knew that bit of trivia? Only Father Curley at St. Benedict's. Shanley was a partner at a top Newark law firm. In 1956, he was assistant chief of staff at the White House and one of Eisenhower's trusted advisors. Shanley contacted Arthur T. Vanderbilt, another distinguished Newark lawyer, who was then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And you can look at his voluminous and wonderful papers at his alma mater, Wesleyan, where he has his wonderfully decorated scraps of Barringer High School among a terrific political collection, giving the inside dope on really nasty Newark politics of the 20s, 30s. Vanderbilt called Lloyd Femley, editor of the Newark News, and asked him for a name. Femley suggested Brennan. Vanderbilt replied, "I knew you'd say that," and Brennan was quickly appointed. In October 1989, Justice Brennan crossed paths in Washington with Amiri Baraka. Baraka was invited to visit the court, as part of a group of well-known writers representing PEN International, an organization that defends authors' rights and cultural freedom in general. The PEN group was to hear an oral argument before the court and then meet with Brennan privately. As happened, all the PEN visitors except for Baraka were white. As it also happened, Baraka arrived a little late, and when he went to join the group, guards stopped him. To make matters worse, the PEN group leader failed to recognize him, so there was more delay while this consulted and so on. Meanwhile, a woman employee of the court saw what was happening and concluded that Baraka was being mistreated because of his race. She fired off an angry letter to Brennan. Brennan, much distressed, asked for an immediate investigation. There was a final report, and more than a month later, the group leader wrote a fairly contrite letter of apology to Baraka. Baraka couldn't resist responding to Brennan. Quote, "There was some verbal exchange, the usual. I took it as just the old skunk odor of slavery, as yet incompletely iced. But it was a momentary discomfort, and certainly I am already hardened to such." For good measure, Baraka included a published statement of his own, calling for an elected Supreme Court. All these documents are in Brennan's Baraka file. Can we leave Washington without looking at the library's 38 boxes of Philip Roth correspondence? Certainly not at this moment in literary history. Here's Roth at the top between some of his Weequahic class of 1950 classmates. When the Roth boxes were first brought out, I noticed right away that some of the folders had a very untidy look. The pages were hastily stuffed in, sticking up all over the place. These folders of letters from famous writers, Saul Bellow, Norman Mailer, Lillian Hillman. Archivists know well what this means: heavy use by researchers who sometimes couldn't be bothered to put things back properly. In any case, these weren't the folders I was interested in. There were other folders labeled just A, B, C, D, etc. These looked quite untouched. I figured they were the folders where I would most likely find letters from ordinary workers. And I was right. There were hundreds of them, filed between endless memos from insurance salesmen, invoices from people doing repairs on Roth's house in Connecticut, and such. There were letters from Weequahic graduates of several generations and from a few favorite teachers that Roth kept in touch with, especially our much admired English teacher, Hannah Litsky, seen here with her nephew, Allen Ginsberg, and Robert Lowenstein, who lost his teaching job soon after Roth graduated in a McCarthyite purge and later returned to teaching at Weequahic. There were a lot of fan letters, reminiscences of neighborhood candy stores and delis, minute descriptions of notable high school ball games of the distant past, letters from friends of Roth's parents, letters from rabbis and others incensed by Portnoy's complaint or struggling to make peace with it. And there were letters from local librarians, Charles Cummings of the Newark Public Library among them, who had helped Roth with his Newark research. It took me several days just to go through all the files, but I devoured every page. These letters really got to me. It was a very emotional experience. It was my school, my neighborhood, quite a few people I knew from years back. In his writings, Roth tells us so much about how he saw Newark. In these letters, we see how Newark thought about Roth. And a side note, Unfortunately, there are almost no copies of Roth's replies in the collection. We would love to have them, but many of the letters don't really seem to have been written as if they expected a reply. They were written because the writers had something they wanted to say, or they wanted to say it to Roth. They're kind of written for the historical record. I found that interesting. The letters that gripped me most were the ones that tried in some way to expand Roth's view of Newark. Here are the two best examples. First, a powerful 20-page handwritten letter from Sam Marks, Weequahic High School class of 1949, just 1 year ahead of Roth. Marks writes of what it was like to be the child of very poor immigrants who couldn't read or write English. Marks's father, who owned a small candy store, died in 1934 of double pneumonia, an almost unbearable tragedy for any family, and far worse than the Depression. Marks moved with his widowed mother to a small apartment on what he calls the wrong side of Lyons Avenue, with no telephone. The Weequahic neighborhood was a culture shock. Anyone with a father who had a job was well off to him. He says he never had any money, even for hot dogs or candy, and he was always on the defensive. There was what he calls a caste system at Weequahic High School, and he remembers being envious of Roth's beautiful girlfriend. Sam Marks did well in school and in sports. He shelved his dream of going to MIT and went to Newark College of Engineering, graduated from NYU Law School, and at the time of writing, 1991, he was quite well off. He ends by asking Roth to write a book on the theme of the fatherless boy and says, "We have our own private devils and unfulfilled desires that may never be satisfied." In 1984, Roth received a letter from George Curitan, Associate Professor of Humanities at Medgar Evers College in New York. Curitan, born and raised in Newark, was a former teacher in the city schools who had developed a novel system for teaching reading in the late 1960s. His research was partly funded by Kenneth Clark's organization, thus proving yet again that in Newark history, everything is connected. The reading program was tested in 2 Newark schools, apparently with considerable success, and Curitan went on to serve on various educational commissions and task forces. He was New Jersey's Teacher of the Year in 1969. He begins his letter to Roth. "You are one of my favorite writers, and I'd like to share with you what it was like living on the other side of Newark." He encloses a copy of his essay, My Ghetto Then and Now, published in Moment, a Jewish magazine. It's a memoir of growing up as a Black boy in the Central Ward, with a mother who worked as a domestic for a Jewish family. He writes eloquently about Black-Jewish relations, poverty, communist groups in the city, Southside High School, and more. He must have struck a chord with Roth because in a later Curitan letter, we find that Roth has replied and has mentioned Viola, a Black lady who worked for the Roth family as a maid. Curitan is pretty sure that this was a woman he knew well and called Aunt Viola. He says he'd love to be able to verify this, but sadly she had died a few years earlier. Curitan has written more Newark stories, he says, as yet unpublished, and he sends Roth a typescript of one, an intense, moving account of a Black high school student's slowly dawning realization that his close friend is gay. I don't know if Blake Bailey has used these Newark letters in his new blockbuster Roth biography, but we'll find out soon. It may be that Roth will now become a literary destination. like James Joyce's Dublin or Paul Bellows' Chicago. But whether your starting point is Ross Nook or your own, I urge you to dig into the sources, challenge your own assumptions and everyone else's. Newark's is such a rich and complicated history. It's so very well worth the effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. That was terrific. That was really good. Now I have a few questions, and I just wanted to remind our audience that if they want to leave a question for Gail, they can type it in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Well, there's one question there already. Oops. Okay. Gail, have you come across any information about Peter Rodino? That's John Prieto is asking.
Yeah, nothing, kind of new and exciting. His papers are at Seton Hall Law School in Newark. Pretty large collection, but it's mostly official stuff. I must say I have not really yet come across anything, new and different about Rodino. The Rodino story is very much connected with the campaign I talked about to redistrict the 10th congressional district. Rodino was in place and had been congressman from that district for many years when the district lines were redrawn, and he was so popular that he remained in office even after the new lines were drawn and made the district predominantly Black. He was able to stay on long enough to chair the Nixon impeachment hearings and so forth. But eventually he retired and Donald Payne took over. So he comes into the story there. But what's interesting that he was so popular that he was elected quite a few times, even after the district became very heavily Black.
So you did a lot of this research, most of this research before the COVID lockdown. Are you aware of any of the repositories that you visited, if any of them are open now?
As far as I know, not. The Newark Public Library, fortunately, is. But I have not yet heard of any of the ones in Washington that I used being open, or Philadelphia for that matter, or New England. I should say when I used the phrase tip of the iceberg, I could have done the same program about Philadelphia, what you find in Philadelphia or New England or even California. Lots of gay collections, lots of film collections, and Ginsberg's papers. I mean, there is just so much out there. It's extraordinary.
So someone is asking, somebody asked about Peter Rodino. Now someone is asking about Hugh Adonisio. Did you find anything about Adonisio?
Oh, well, I was really hoping somebody would ask about Adonisio because, everyone hates him. I mean, I found interesting now after the fact. It was the case when he was a young liberal congressman, and he remained very popular in the Italian community. There's a wonderful series of files of correspondence in the papers of, I think it's Harrison Williams at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where Adonisio is in prison, and his constituents from North Newark write in what are some really poignant and interesting letters about why he should be given kind of early release. And they just sort of pour their hearts out about him, and that's quite interesting. But the story I wanted to tell is how Adonisio humiliated Kenneth Clark. It happened in 1966, just before, at the very tail end of Adonisio's reign as mayor. Kenneth Clark was appointed chair of a blue ribbon committee that was to select the new superintendent of schools for Newark. And it really was a very ritzy committee. The president of Seton Hall University was on it and so on. And Kenneth Clark took the job really very seriously. The committee held its meetings at the Harvard Club in New York, and they interviewed many applicants. The applications are there. Clark has saved thick files of this material because he was so burned by the experience. They interviewed many qualified candidates, including some Black applicants, and After the process was completed, the committee submitted its report, and Clark was lavishly thanked, effusively thanked for his work, his time, et cetera, et cetera. But then he got a call abruptly one day to say that one of Adoniesio's cronies, Franklin Titus, was going to be appointed. They just took his work and threw it out the window. So in later years, Clark was able to get a measure of revenge on Titus. He sent a super brilliant young assistant of his, a research assistant, to Newark, a young woman who was tasked with doing a report on the state of education in Newark. And this was probably in the late 70s or so. And she managed to charm Titus and some of his colleagues into doing very frank interviews in which they forgot themselves enough to make some extremely unpleasant remarks about Blacks and Puerto Ricans, which are now on the record, at least if you look in the Clark papers. But Clark was badly burned by this experience, and it was hard for him to come to terms with Newark over the years. You know, that's Adonisio for you. We could tell other stories. There are many other collections about people who were burned by Adonisio.
Do you have any, as someone was asking, if you have any idea of what collections might be best for Newark's Gilded Age history?
Well, it really depends on what kind of aspects you're looking for. Every collection has sort of its own slant, its own take. It really depends a lot on, you know, what it is you want to emphasize. We don't have as much in industrial history as we would like to have. There are some collections, and you can sort of piece together. Church history is very rich, and a lot of it is kind of based in that period. Really big churches were built and developed, a lot of them in the 1890s and after. The political history, you're probably going to turn more to printed sources. But, you know, if you get a sense of what it is you're looking for, you can start looking and searching in our database. I would say for that period, you probably can do a lot in Newark. Between the New Jersey Historical Society and the Newark Public Library, the fact is you can do a lot. You don't really have to go to Washington, but, you know, great riches awaiting you there if you do.
Thanks for the plug. So as someone else is saying, astounding talk, Gail. When you start digging into the National Archives, where will you start and what are you most looking forward to?
Well, tragically, the main facility of the National Archives is in College Park, Maryland, not in Washington, D.C. at all. So I'll have to stay out there. It's a huge fortress-like facility. And I already have kind of a list of things to look for. There's a kind of a stumbling block with the National Archives in that their holdings are so vast and they're required to take such vast quantities of material that they really don't have the staff to do the kind of detailed finding aids that enable us to zero in on New Jersey materials and Newark materials. But with the help of such friends, Mark Krasovic, who did a lot of work in government records for his book and his subsequent work on the 60s, 70s, 80s, he's told me of a lot of government agencies to look at. OEO, HUD, and so on. WPA records from the 30s and 40s are always a great source. You know, I have a list, I have my notes. You kind of do the best you can and you hope you stumble upon an archivist willing to help you, which is a whole lot less likely to happen at the National Archives than at the Library of Congress. I use people's footnotes, people's bibliographies, whatever I can.
Anything new about organized crime influence in Newark government? Discover anything?
Yes, yeah, I wish I could remember. I recently was looking at, wow, this is terrible, you know, kind of senior moment, but there really is a lot of stuff. I mean, one of the places you can look and have a good time looking is in Warren Grover's papers at the Jewish Historical Society. of New Jersey, because in the research for his book projects, he really looked so closely at Newark sources for 20s and 30s, and he's done everybody the service of clipping various newspapers, including the Yiddish press and so forth and so on. There's a ton of stuff, including about Longy's woman and the problems of Mayor Ellenstein in the 30s. If you look up Ellenstein in our database, you'll find a number of collections that have a lot of details about election scandals, land deals, corruption of all kinds. You can do it, but I have to confess, I'm an archivist, but the newspapers, of course, are a great resource for all of this stuff. And for the newspapers, you will, of course, go to the Newark Public Library.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. This was really terrific. And thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to say one more thing. Someone is actually giving you a recommendation, Ron Becker, actually. When you get to the National Archives, you will find some relevant Newark material in the legislative committee records, such as labor and human resources, education, etc. These committees often investigated issues in the city. And he says, keep up the great work. So thank you for this presentation. And now back to Tim Crist. Tim? You're muted.
Mute there, yeah. I've made screenshots of all the complimentary comments here, Gail, and I'll send them to you. I've never seen a program with so many positive comments coming out. So this is terrific. Somebody asked, what's the end goal of your research, a book, which would be fantastic, but your end goal is really to put as much information into the Newark Archives project database, isn't it?
It's to get other people to write the books. I mean, I really foolishly started out at the beginning thinking, this is going to be a great project. I'll look at all the archives that have material on Newark, and we'll look at all of it, and there it will be. And now I see a very, very long tunnel with no light at the end of it. I mean,
well, that makes it a perfect project for you, given your determination and dedication. But
well,
so what are you hoping to focus on in the next year or two?
I'll focus on hoping that the libraries will open. And my folder of leads, which is now a computerized folder because I couldn't stand all of the bits of paper, is so thick. It's sort of where do you go next? And I have lists of archives that we haven't looked at yet. I really would like to spend some more time in New England. Yale, whose first president was a Newarker, is just crammed with Newark collections, and I've only done a few of them so far. I'd like to get up to Boston. There's some collections in Boston that have a lot of Newark detail. We've been able to describe them from their finding aids, but I really like to get a chance to look at the boxes. There's one in particular, there's a collection of Leslie Fiedler papers. Leslie Fiedler, the literary critic, born, raised, and with an intense love-hate relationship to Newark, has a collection at Boston University that's full of letters from people who were of my parents' generation, many of whom were friends of my parents. And it's just a really dense collection of Newark material from the 30s that I'd really like to look at. But I just, I'm not even thinking, there's so many things that I want.
We look forward to that. And I think everybody can see why the Newark History Society has made the support of the Newark Archives project a really key focus of all our efforts. Because overall, we want to encourage the understanding of Newark history, but also research and writing about Newark history. And there is no greater aid than the Newark Archives project database for any sort of project. And we're particularly proud that, to our knowledge, there's no other city in the United States that has attempted to do what Gail is doing, and that is provide detailed descriptions of, as she says, more than 4,000 archival collections so far. And with a good keyword search engine, you can really find a great number of leads. Gail, I think this is the third time you've done a summary of your work. We'll see how long we're going to have you back for a fourth time to talk again about everything you're finding. It really is illuminating.
Only after the archives are closed. And
Yeah,
I
no, we'll let you find lots more to report on. So, Tom, I think we can end it here. And I just want to say thank you again to you, Gail, for this evening. It's really been fascinating. And thank you to everybody who joined. And we hope that you'll continue to use the Newark Public Library's resources and that you'll continue to support the Newark History Society. Thank you and good night.